I'm Mark Golub, and in the news, the ongoing political clash in America that's created a cavernous divide between those who drip with hatred and contempt for Donald Trump and those who do not. The most vociferous hatred, of course, is coming from Democrats on the far left, who view Donald Trump not simply as unqualified and incompetent to be president, but as venal, malevolent, evil. Well, one American commentator writing about the turmoil in our country is Commentary magazine's assistant online editor, Noah Rothman, who has written a series of superb pieces which in many ways span the divide, taking on both Democrats and Republicans. And in one of his most recent pieces, Noah published an op-ed under the title, Failing a Test of Character, with the subhead, The Resistance Isn't Worth Tearing the Country Apart. Well, I'm so pleased to welcome to JBS Noah Rothman. Noah, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Noah, first of all, I want to say to you, I find you to be a superb writer. I read many of the pieces you've done. You are very good. What is your background? Where do you come from?
Physically, I'm from New Jersey.
Okay.
But yes, I've worked in the business of political commentary since 2010. I've been writing about it professionally since 2010. And prior to that, I was a news talk radio producer in New York City at WABC. And prior to that, I was pursuing a career in performance arts. So I suppose there's a few elements to my whole background that led me to this.
Well, good for you.
Place.
Good for you. Who did you produce for at ABC?
John Batchelor.
Very nice. Where'd you go to college?
Undergraduate, I went to Drew University on a theater scholarship, but I ended up graduating with a Russian studies degree. And I went to Seton Hall University for grad school, where I studied IR and left with a focus on the post-Soviet space and security policy.
Noah, you have such a diverse, interesting background. Tell us one little thing about your own, your growing up, who your parents were. You grew up as just a plain old Jewish kid, or what?
My mother is Catholic, Irish Catholic. My father is a agnostic New York Jew.
All right.
So I'm kind of in the middle of a lot of worlds there. I didn't grow up in a very religious household. It was secular. But my father is in drug development, and my mother is a homemaker, the hardest working Rothman of all of us. And I live currently in Bridgewater, New Jersey with my wife, Jaren, and my 2 young children.
That's lovely. Okay. Noah, Commentary is understood to be a publication on the right. How do you self-define yourself on the political spectrum?
I consider myself a conservative, but I haven't always. It wasn't long ago that I thought conservatives were unduly not reflective enough, hostile towards incrementalism, to the point where they were hostile toward their own interests, self-defeating. I have since become more conservative and less Republican, particularly as I've watched the Republican Party embrace an ideology embodied in Donald Trump that is not especially conservative, not conservative, but mostly not conservative, populist, rabble-rousing, irresponsible, I believe. And while I think conservatism offers the best solutions for the country on a policy perspective, I understand the appeal of populism and the courage that it takes to avoid the temptation toward embracing populism, a courage that I have not seen embodied by the current Republican establishment in Washington. So as the Republican, I used to identify very much with the Republican quote-unquote establishment because of its espousal of incrementalism. But as that philosophy has simply become an espousal of incrementalism in an embrace of populist ideals, I find myself much more of a conservative.
By the way, explain to our audience, what do you mean by incrementalism?
The philosophy that you are better served by getting some of what you want and not all of it all at once. And the virtues of incrementalism are that the virtues of incrementalism are embodied by the modern American left. Democrats have been pursuing incrementalist policies for all of my adult life, and they veered very far away from that vision in 2009 and 2010 when Democrats found themselves with prohibitive political power in Washington and behind Barack Obama, whose mission was to pursue as much and as quickly of a progressive transformation of the country as he possibly could. And they were very successful and effective in that. And they sacrificed upon the altar of progress just about every Democrat who represented the moderate middle. They find themselves now currently at the nadir of their political power in nearly 100 years. And that's what happens when you pursue comprehensive forms of reformation, of really socially rollicking change that shape the bedrock of society. Americans don't respond well to that. They never really have. And so in the absence of a crisis, and Democrats sort of convinced themselves that they had a Depression-era crisis on their hands, when in fact the people who had been so severely negatively affected by that downturn weren't of the scale and scope of the Depression. It was much smaller in scale than I think they knew. Everybody was touched by that, but we didn't have 10, 15, 20% unemployment. We didn't have the crises of breadlines in the streets. We didn't have near revolutionary sentiment like we did in the 30s. So to pursue a grand shift in the American Compact, as they did in the New Deal, with the the Affordable Care Act, was a very big mistake, and it's one I don't think anyone has really internalized on the left, and maybe Republicans didn't even really fully internalize it, as they performed their own reformation of the entire healthcare system absent a crisis.
Fascinating evaluation. Incidentally, do you feel that in some way the swing to the far left for the last 8 years caused Donald Trump to be elected, a move in some way to towards the right?
Sure, absolutely. I don't think that's arguable, frankly. Donald Trump sort of marries a lot of elements of traditional conservatism and traditional democratic populism that I think the American public responds to quite a bit. They see him as a problem solver. They see him as divorced from the traditionally rigid ideological divides that most Americans don't share. Most Americans are not ideologues. They're not even political. In fact, they're more likely to see political ideology as a threat to progress than an aspect of it. I'm far more comfortable with ideology than that. I think pragmatism, which is the philosophy to which most populists appeal, that which is most effective in the moment, will inevitably lead you to embrace solutions that are at odds with the Constitution. Pragmatism and ideology, particularly conservative ideology, are sort of antithetical to one another. Conservatism as a philosophy would lead you to refuse to make certain choices that pragmatism would otherwise make inevitable. For example, appeals to the coercive force of government authority. If you're enticed by the idea of pragmatism, of getting things done right away as quickly as possible, the power of the federal government is an irresistible force. Only the ideology of conservatism would stay your hand.
Okay. Am I correct then to say that if one looks at the totality of your pieces, there are some which are critical of Democrats and some are critical of Republicans?
Yeah, I think that's certainly fair.
Okay.
I think both sides of that argument would say I'm more critical of one than the other, usually themselves.
Okay. In your piece of March 3rd, Failing a Test of Character, this is what you write. Democrats have adopted a sort of intransigence and paranoia in response to Trump that should be familiar to Republicans. But the costs of their campaign of resistance to American political comity may yet become too much to bear. Okay, Noah, what are you trying to say?
Well, this is sort of a continuation of a theme that I've been writing about since August of last year when I chronicled for the magazine a piece called Whose Violence Is It?, in which I noted that the violence that had been performed by Donald Trump supporters and egged on by Donald Trump himself was widely castigated and reported on, but the violence directed at Trump supporters, organized in its own way, was not being reported, and it was much more prolific, and it was much more scary because of its nature, because it was grassroots, because it was organized in a way, and because it didn't occur simply in one venue or the other. It was occurring outside these venues and often. And we're beginning to see some of that violence materialize on the anti-Trump side in the Trump era. The Women's March, for example, was notably nonviolent and passive, and actually it probably converted many people, but it was criticized from the far left for not being transgressive enough, including violence, acts of violence. What I ask in that piece, unspoken as though it is that eventually Democrats will retake power. I mean, the lesson of American history is that there are pendulum swings. Republicans win sometimes, Democrats win sometimes. So they're going to take power again, but what will they inherit? What kind of country are they going to have when they've delegitimized all these institutions and empowered violence, the violent acts of violence? What kind of country will Democrats win? Will they be able to govern it? Would they even want to govern it? Very imprudent things are happening in the name of political expediency on both sides of the aisle. Republicans are getting all the focus right now, naturally, because they have the White House. But Democrats deserve a lot more scrutiny than they're receiving.
Very interesting. You do know that there will be Democrats watching right now who will say to you, but there were so many, and you said it yourself, there were so many peaceful, large marches. Why do you harp on what they argue are the few minor here and there expressions of violence?
Because these sort of things come to characterize a movement. Look, the Women's March was criticized from the left, not from the right and from the center, from members of the activist progressive class, who, by the way, have overtaken this party. The Blue Dogs are extinct. They were sacrificed in order to achieve the Affordable Care Act, the stimulus, Barney Frank, et cetera, so forth. The moderate middle of the Democratic Party was purged by the voters and by the Democrats themselves. Those who will replace that element of the party are from a much more progressive wing, because that's the wing that is in ascendancy. There is no moderate wing of this party that is winning much purchase. It may again in the future, but it hasn't right now. And if they're to regain power in 2018, 2020, 2024, et cetera, the party that is going to be reflected in this new expansive Democratic Party, even if it retakes moderate districts, is going to be a much more progressive party. And they're going to be much more beholden to an activist progressive wing that they will perceive to be their base. Republicans, Democrats now know. Every Democrat listening will say to themselves, well, the Republican base is certainly the problem. They're much more conservative, much more insanely activist than any Republicans that we used to know, the good Republicans back in the day. That's a trope, but it is one that necessarily Democrats do believe, and there is some truth to it. Democrats would do well to consider what kind of base their party is going to be beholden to in 2020 and 2024 if the current trajectory of the parties, what I believe is to be a trajectory towards radicalism, continues.
Okay. There are a couple of questions I want to ask you that come out of all the things you've just said. First of all, you do understand, Noah, how many, many people, the overwhelming majority of American Jews, can not only believe that Donald Trump defeated Hillary Clinton, they detest him. They have serious concerns over what he'll do to the social fabric of America in the areas of health care, women's reproductive rights, education, the environment. And they are terrified he might, in a peak one day, use nuclear weapons and destroy humanity as we know it. That's why many Americans are demonstrating in the street, and they feel they are not only justified, they have a moral responsibility to do everything they can to remove Donald Trump from office before he causes disaster. What would you say to Americans who feel this way?
I would say that I don't necessarily disagree with a lot of their fears, although as a conservative, I don't share the concerns about the social fabric or the social welfare state, for example. I believe that needs to be reformed. I believe that some of the ways in which Donald Trump came to power on the back of some of the most fringe figures of the right, many of whom are beholden to the quote-unquote alt-right, which is just a fancy word for racist white nationalists, are very concerning to me. It's something that I have been speaking out about and will continue to do so. At the same time, I would urge them to go back and review the rhetoric which they used to attack Ronald Reagan, George W. Bush. The notion that this president is going to unleash nuclear Armageddon upon the planet is a familiar one. Just because it happens to hold more weight now because he's a more mercurial, paranoid person, doesn't render it more true. Particularly in the eyes of partisans. Democrats have been crying wolf about Republicans being warmongers and wanting to use atomic weapons for the betterment of nobody but their inner cabal for the last 30 years. Democrats to go back and review some of the rhetoric that their leaders were using in public about those last two-term Republican presidents and see whether or not they are due some censure and some introspection. Again, I don't think that they're wrong to be concerned about the nature of this presidency. This is a man who is beholden to his impulses and not any ideology, and I think that's dangerous. But at the same time, I do think Democrats have not kept their powder dry for when they really needed it.
Mm-hmm. Now, you also said that there are some things that the mainstream media is not reporting. How do you regard the mainstream media's coverage of the Trump presidency? And we've heard him really express enormous displeasure with the media. And the media then says, you know, he's trying to destroy the First Amendment. How do you feel the media has behaved, and what does it do vis-a-vis the Trump administration?
Well, the first thing is you can't really call media a monolith. I mean, it is so fractured. The audiences are so divided and so polarized and tribal now that there is no such thing as media. There are various outlets to which a lot of people, appreciate and enjoy, but they're different. They have very different views and they're very factionalized. So it's hard to generalize. What we used to call, and I will for the sake of concision, the mainstream media has been pretty hysterical, has been prone to lash out at what they consider to be precedents when they are not unprecedented in this Trump administration. In that sense, I do think the president has something to say, has some value to his criticisms. At the other end of that, I don't think much of the president's criticisms are of value. I think they're basically blame shifting. Mobilizing anti-media sentiment is about the only thing that unites the right these days, and it didn't happen in a vacuum. Media needs to perform some introspection on its own, but mobilizing that sentiment from the White House is extremely irresponsible. I don't think that that's something that should be lauded, and it will have deleterious effects on the nation's comedy. But the press could be doing itself a lot more favors by reporting on this White House in a more circumspect fashion, and by not setting its hair on fire over every little event. Only the latest of which is the firing of 46 prosecutors 50 days into this administration, which is standard by any measure by which you measured standard administration behavior. And to call this, outrageous, even though New York prosecutor Preet Bharara wanted to make a big deal of it to the point where he forced the White House's hands to fire him and wanted that headline, obviously, that doesn't make it unusual. This is something that has remained standard. So calling things that are standard practice is like the minimal level of competency we can expect from the media, and we're not seeing that. So that's something I think the press does deserve some criticism for.
Very beautifully said. Noah, have you taken any criticism within commentary for the positions you've taken?
Well, we have lively debates in the audience. We have a podcast that we do twice a week where these debates in real time behind the microphones. I urge everyone to check those out. But, we discuss and we debate within the offices. But generally, I think we all share a pretty comprehensive base level worldview. So, I mean, to the extent that we argue with each other, it's never definitive and, intractable. I think we always get over those.
Very good. One of the concerns inside the Jewish community, again, the Jewish community votes 70% Democrat. There is a concern, however, especially among Jews who care very deeply about the state of Israel, that the Democratic Party has moved too far to the left, or better said, the far left has in some way captured the mainstream Democratic Party. And the Keith Ellison issue symbolized for many American Jews the problem, the danger inherent in the direction the Democratic Party was going. Speak to that for a bit. To what extent do you understand the Jewish concern for where the left wing of the Democratic Party is dragging the party?
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to say that this would be a tipping point, but I don't know that it is, right? I mean, I'm not sure that demographies change, their political allegiances change. I mean, the history of the United States is in demographies. Even the 2016 election is the story of demographies that were typically for one party shifting to another. So there's nothing set in stone. Coalitions are very fluid. And Democrats should not count on the support of Jews forever. But, I mean, what's going to do it? I mean, if the fact that Keith Ellison came within, I think, 20 votes of becoming the leader of this party, when he opposed, for example, supporting the Iron Dome funding in Israel because it kept Jews from dying, because it prevented Israeli Jews from being killed at a commensurate level with Gazans, and thus remove the incentive structure for Israel to cease hostilities and come to the table. And that was the logic he deployed on Meet the Press. I mean, if you're unable to see that for what it is, and this is 2014, by the way, we're not talking about his college days when he was palling around with individuals who were very highly critical of the state of Israel and its existence. This is 2 years ago. I don't understand what the threshold is going to be at that point. American Jews tend to be far more liberal than even their Israeli counterparts, but I feel like that's just very much socialization, and that's not something that changes in a generation. It'll take quite some time. But Keith Ellison represents a form of progressive radicalism and hostility towards Israel that is very much in vogue on the left, but it is not reflected in much of the country. Most of the country still remains very supportive of Israel and very suspicious of the two factions running the non-contiguous Palestinian territories.
Yes.
So the American left is sort of out on its own limb, and I think that's where it likes to be. I mean, that's sort of the story of the current state of the Democratic Party, right? It is very small, rump, factional, isolated to the coasts and in urban centers, and that seems to be where it wants to be. It's sort of like the old Marx Brothers or Groucho Marx reference. I wouldn't want to be in a club that would have me as a member. They like their club small and elite and homogeneous, and that's how they're going to have it.
How can they ever regain power then?
I don't know if the Democratic Party has to change to regain power. The American public doesn't like monolithic parties. They don't like having one-party governments in Washington, and I suspect that the headwinds are going to be against Republicans, even if they do really well.
Yes.
I suspect they're going to face some headwinds. And that's just by virtue of the fact that Americans sort of like divided government. So that's what I expect, but Democrats will have to figure out a way to appeal to districts that are not deep blue, gerrymandered districts, so that you have a lot of Democrats in them, to the point where you don't have to really be a thoughtful politician to win as a Democrat in those districts. They will have to broaden their message. I think there are people within the party that are trying to thread that needle now. But, it's complicated. The party, as you said, the faction that is dominant right now is progressives. And in order to appeal to a wing of the party that is not socially conservative, but maybe fiscally conservative, Democrats are going to have to figure out how to win that message, especially when identity politics is just about the only thing that unites every Democrat on the left and repulses every swing voter they need.
Yes. Did Donald Trump win because America is basically racist and that somehow he appealed to the dark side of the American people?
Yeah, I don't think that's true. Not just because I don't want to think that's true, but I honestly don't believe that's true. Look, Donald Trump managed to win a lot of voters who probably wouldn't have voted for him 2 weeks prior to the election, prior to Jim Comey's announcement. I think Democrats are doing their best not to confront the fact that Hillary Clinton was not just a lackluster candidate, but a hopelessly flawed candidate. Americans were faced with two very unappealing choices, and they made the lesser of the two unappealing choices. And Democrats seem to think that they're absolved by the fact that Donald Trump only won 46% of the vote to Hillary Clinton's 48 point something. That's an indictment. That's not an absolution. The Democratic base is so poorly distributed along the coasts that it can't even win a national election, even though it wins 3 million more votes. That, to me, should be a screaming warning sign for Democrats. Instead, it's sort of given them some sort of comfort. There's no comfort in that. If your base is that poorly distributed, and that you have so few members of this industrial middle America that support your message, even when the other guy is somebody who is as crude and boorish and lewd and unappealing to people with traditional conservative values as Donald Trump is, I mean, you really have to consider what you've done wrong there. And Democrats have done everything in their power not to make that consideration. So it may take a while.
Okay. And what about the claim that Donald Trump is really a fascist and that some of the things he does and says is an attempt to recreate, not an attempt, but that he is in fact recreating the conditions which were in place that brought Hitler and Nazi Germany to power? Do you worry that Donald Trump is that kind of individual?
I used to. Early on in the campaign, I used to.
What changed your mind?
I don't anymore. I don't anymore because I don't believe he's an ideologue. I don't think he has any ideology. As we said earlier in the program, I think he is a pragmatist. He thinks in terms of what works in the moment, and that can lead you to some sort of a very dangerous anti-democratic, anti-Republican, little r, Republican ideas. But being a fascist means being an ideologue, means having an ideology, and not just the idea that, you know, whatever works in the moment should work in the moment. So I don't see an ideology in Donald Trump, and certainly I think that people who believe that we're in the middle of a fascist takeover have demonstrated no faith in the system of constitutional restraints that we have. Just look at the way in which the initial executive order was rolled out. It was disastrously implemented, very poorly conceived and poorly written. It was halted in the courts. It resulted in spontaneous demonstrations, politically potent demonstrations, which organized the Democratic Party and eliminated the possibility that there could be any cooperation from Democrats on issues like a $1 trillion infrastructure project, which is something they want. No Democrat's going to sign on to that now, because to work with Donald Trump is anathema. Not only because Donald Trump managed to make a political mistake there and a legal mistake. And that's the sort of thing that our system thwarts. The Constitution is not impervious, but it's a pretty darn good vehicle for preventing the kind of tyranny that Democrats seem to think is upon us. And I think they should demonstrate a little bit more faith in the articles. They work.
Okay. Well, I appreciate how thoughtful you are. We only have a minute or so left, so I need a very short answer. Do you believe there's any evidence to show that Donald Trump or some major individual in his administration was in collusion with Russia to influence the election?
I don't have that evidence. I'm not sure anybody does. I do think it was pretty conspicuous the way in which Donald Trump was adhering to the ideals of Vladimir Putin, to deferring to Russian geopolitical objectives. That's very weird, but his administration has not made good on it. They don't have a Russia policy. They have a very confused Russia policy. And Russia's acting out in a manner that suggests they're not happy with this administration. So if there was collusion during the election campaign, it's over now.
Okay. Again, it's wonderful to talk to you, Noah. I hope you let me call you again. You are thoughtful and articulate, and I appreciate the time you give us on JBS. You be well. We will talk again often.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure. Talk to you soon.
The thoughts of Noah Rothman, assistant online editor for Commentary magazine. Again, a very thoughtful young man. My thanks, as always, to our director and production coordinator, Serge Goldberg, JBS's associate director, Dara Golub, editors Dennis Golan and John McDevitt, and to the producer of In the News, Carol Lilienthal. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.